Today is Wednesday, March 1st, 2023. I am Jeanette Pincus, and I have the honor of interviewing A.J. Rosmarin today. I'd like you to share what led you to this leadership position.
So I moved to Dallas in middle of 1979, knew no one, came here to run a hospital. One of the first things I did was came to the J to figure out where to live, and joined the J and started my journey. Married Sue Ellen, settled, lived here, got involved with, all the way back with Jewish National Fund in the early 80s, and then the J, and somehow made my way to the Federation in the early 2000s. And so through that journey, never really thought I'd have a leadership position until probably 2007, when Carol Aaron, who was the board chair, asked me to co-chair the campaign with Barbara Stein. So that put me on a different track. And then about 5 years before I became board chair in June of 19, I think Cindy Moskowitz asked me to be an officer and suggested that if I accepted, that would put me on a track to maybe become chair one day. So while I never really planned on it, in June 19 I became the chair of the Federation until June 21.
Okay. What was the Federation's official name during your tenure?
It was always the Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, and at this point it's 112 years in Dallas.
And what was the title that you had?
So my title was board chair, and during my tenure I was one of 16 board chairs who were present. And what I did before I became board chair the last 6 months is I reached out to every one of them in person, because I wanted to see if there was anything that they'd experienced that they wanted to share with me, unique. But I always asked each of them one question, and the answer was generally the same, and that was, how did you deal with bullies? And the answer was, you just deal with it. You don't, what I'd say, sell your soul, you just move on.
So the various leaders, you mentioned some already. Who else did you work with?
So I worked really probably close with past board chairs, but especially the ones of nearest tenure, like Cindy Moskowitz, Dan Prescott, Mark Creditor, and then Bill Finkelstein, who became chair-elect my second year, and so we all worked pretty close together. But all the board chairs were always available, and I made it a point to meet with them as a group a couple of times a year to keep them in the loop.
What was your relationship between the Federation was with the synagogues and temples in our area?
It was emerging. I think there was a period many years ago where especially the Rabbinical Society of Dallas was a little more independent, and I think probably over the last 10 years that relationship has really gelled, and they've become an integral part of the messaging for the Federation. So I think we have a really great relationship. And one of the things that I did during my tenure was I was invited to speak at most of the larger synagogues, either at their board meetings or in the case of Beth Torah, I actually gave the Devar Torah one Shabbos, which was an interesting experience.
How do you feel the Jewish community interacted with the Dallas secular and other religious communities?
Yeah, I think really well, and so about 8 years ago the Federation started an interfaith Seder where we invited members from all over the community, feeling that it was best to embrace our friends before we needed something. We just felt it was just good to have them by our side. And this interfaith Seder over the last 8 years, with the exception of 20 and 21 when the pandemic prevented us from having our interfaith Seder, we would have upwards of 500 people from all denominations meet for dinner and go through a modified Haggadah.
That's nice. You mentioned an interfaith Seder. Was there any other coalitions of organizations or the government outside the Jewish community that was connected with us?
I think we've had a great relationship with the city of Dallas and the mayors, especially Mayor Johnson, over the last few years, who's really been by our side during a challenging period, which we can talk about a little bit, but when the tornado hit, it caused a big challenge for us on this campus.
Can you go further on with that?
So in October 19, the tornado hit, as many know, and it caused major damage to the Federation's building, into the J, and to many homes, businesses in our area. And it really was more than just the impact to the bricks and mortar, but there were organizations that were impacted. And then combine that from October 19, then in March of 20, pandemic began. And so we had some serious issues where there were organizations whose livelihood and sustainability was at risk, because many organizations have their annual functions in the spring, and so you think back to the spring of 20, there was nothing. And so with the cooperation of the then chair of the Dallas Jewish Community Foundation, Andy Dropkin, he and I got together and developed a program where the Federation and the Foundation would contribute money to a fund, and then we had a small group representing both organizations whose sole purpose was to reach out to organizations who had really down to their last dollars. They were in dire straits. They'd exhausted reaching out to any financial institutions or individuals for fundraising, and if we didn't provide some funding, they were going to be out of business. So we really were a lifeline, and for the next year significantly impacted their ability to stay in business.
Wow, so you had two significant events happening during your
I did.
time.
I had that, and then to top it all off, we had the war in Israel that occurred during that period too. And so, thinking back, one of the past board chairs I was meeting with once toward the end of my tenure said, "Wow, I think I remarked to them that I was probably the right person at the wrong time." And they said, "No, you were probably the right person at the right time, because I'm a businessman. I've been in the healthcare business my entire career on the business side, not the clinical side. And so I just have dealt with everything like a transaction. I'm pretty balanced, and everybody knows that. And so I just managed my way through it and figured there was no sense getting caught up in the emotion of it. We just had a job to do, and well, it worked out." But I've told people that at the Federation office there's pictures of all the past board chairs on the wall, and they probably should put an asterisk by mine, because I had the pandemic and the tornado, and then we had the war, and so, but here we are on the other side of it, all the better for it.
Mentioning about the war in Israel, how did you feel the relationship was with the Dallas community with Israel, and how supportive you were?
Yeah, so I think it's always been real strong, and part of the funding that the Federation provides, not just in Dallas, but in Israel and throughout the world, is funding for Israel through our relationship with the Jewish Agency for Israel and the American Joint Distribution Committee. And so we send funding to them, but in addition we have a relationship in the Western Galilee, so pretty much everywhere from north of Haifa to the Lebanese border, where that's just a connection that Dallas has with that part of Israel. And so I think it's really very strong.
What changes do you feel the Dallas Jewish community has experienced just within the short few years with all these things that just had happened?
So the building's been renovated, which is important, and it's beautiful, and we pretty much had to take it almost down to the studs. Thankfully we had good insurance, but we also had the opportunity to update the facility from when it was built in the mid-90s. So we did that, but over and above that, it's the fact that the Dallas-Fort Worth area is growing almost as much as anywhere in the country. So we have people moving here all the time, and as it relates to the Dallas Federation, because our area is different than Fort Worth. So Fort Worth has their own federation. The Dallas area that it serves is Dallas, Collin, Denton, and Rockwall counties, and so those have experienced explosive growth. So the main thing we've realized is outreach. There are Jews moving to the Dallas area, and they're moving north, and they're moving way far away from where we sit here in North Dallas. And so you've got Jews in Prosper and Salina, and I think back when I was, again, during my period as board chair, I was invited in December of 19 to the menorah lighting at the Frisco City Hall, mid-December. So Sue Ellen and I went up there thinking, I don't know that anyone will be there, and there were probably 300 people for a menorah lighting at the Frisco City Hall. And for those who know, it's probably 25 miles from here, and the explosive growth of Frisco, but it's that type of thing where it's really a major impetus that we've been pushing each succeeding board chair. I know Bill Finkelstein has pushed it more than I have, and just because we have so many people moving here that are Jewish, we have no clue, and there's no real registration. It's just word of mouth, and we're trying to be visible for those because they also have needs.
Did you feel Dallas has been a cohesive community?
I think it's getting more and more cohesive. For years, the temples and synagogues were pretty isolated and competitive, and then I think everyone realized we were all connected at the hip, and so it's great that we have such a great group of rabbis in our community. We are really blessed, and they all work closely together because it's one, it's all for one, and I think the main beneficiary of that is our Jewish community, because the rabbis are the heart and soul of our Jewish community.
In relation to your time at the Federation, what do you feel you're most proud of?
Well, I saw us through some significant events, and the fundraising wasn't impacted, and we were able to do things on a proactive basis as it related to individuals and organizations who were out of luck through no fault of their own. And so I, like anything, you want to leave things in a better place than when you got in, and so out of all due respect to my predecessors, I think I was able to maintain that. And on a fundraising side, somehow we raised a little bit more each year than the year before, even with the pandemic, which is pretty significant for everybody.
Are there any other special experiences or stories during your tenure that you'd like to share?
There's just so many. I think when I began my tenure, I looked at my iPhone and I didn't really have any rabbis, and then when I left, I realized that I had rabbis. I just put them all under rabbi, and I had a long list of rabbis who occasionally would reach out to me, but my relationship with the rabbinical community obviously was elevated because, when you're the Federation chair, you're more than just a chair, you're kind of like the mayor. And so I'm very proud of that and the cooperation, for sure. But, there were a couple of interesting things. Unbeknownst to us, there's a small Jewish organization, maybe not so small, 40 rabbis, and one of the things they do a couple times a year is they bring kosher food in for those who have strict kosher needs. And we found out sort of just secondhand that on a Sunday there was a truck that was provided by a local family, by the Aaron family, with frozen food, and they were set up somewhere in North Dallas and distributing food to a combination of families who could pay for Passover or food for Rosh Hashanah. So they did it a couple of times a year, and those who paid, and those who didn't, it just gave it to them anyway. And so that was an opportunity for the Federation to underwrite that, just sort of one-off, and it's just so gratifying to be able to connect with a segment of the community that was kind of laying low and not really as visible, and we're very proud of that.
So wonderful. Well, what have you been doing since your tenure?
Yeah, so from, again, I've heard many times people say that the two best days for a board chair are your first day and your last day. And so from June 21, I stepped back and realized that it was pretty much all consuming for a couple of years, and I owed it to my family for sure to not be as all in, which I was fine because, like everything I do, I'm either all in or all out, and that's just the way I am. So I've been kind of selective. I will say during my tenure, we developed a great relationship with with what was then BB&T Bank, now Truist, which is a corporate sponsor, and through a relationship that was established before I became board chair through one of the executives at BB&T who moved here, they became a major sponsor, and so they continue to be a major sponsor, and so I'm on their board for North Texas. But I'm still involved on the healthcare side. I've been sitting on the board of Presbyterian Hospital of Dallas for 8 years, so I still do that. And I was on the legacy board because of my role as the board chair, but because of my healthcare background, I was asked to stay on. So I still serve on the legacy board since I have some what I call coarse knowledge of the business, and it's just something I feel I can add back to. And then the only organization I was open to joining afterwards was the Holocaust Museum, and that's just a personal story because my parents were Holocaust survivors and ended up in Louisville, Kentucky after World War II, just by chance. Just the UJA, that's the predecessor organization to the Federation, was placing people all over the country, and somehow my parents ended up in Louisville. Passed away long ago, but I know they would have been very proud of the fact that I continue to be involved with the Holocaust Museum because I'm a second generation Holocaust survivor.
AJ, I'd like you to share with us your family background and how this really had an influence on you and what you've been doing with your life.
So, born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. My parents came to Louisville after World War II. They were both born and raised in Poland, and then the war intervened, and they knew each other briefly growing up in the same small city in Poland. Went to different concentration camps. My mother was in a few of them, but my dad was in Auschwitz. Somehow survived. When the war started, he was 15, and when the war ended, he was 21, and survived because he was multilingual. So you think about somebody who was basically in high school, who had value, and that's the way it was back then. If you had a utility, then you survived, and if you didn't, then they killed you. And then his brother, they separated during the war, so I think they were both from like 42 on in concentration camps, and he was a harmonica player, so his value was entertaining the commandant in a few camps, but then he escaped and made his way to, as many did, to Vienna, Austria after the war, and somehow they reconnected. And my dad went to college at the University of Vienna for a couple of years, and then got the opportunity to come to the U.S. and dropped everything, and they came here in 1948 and ended up in Louisville just because UJA was placing families in different cities, and they ended up in Louisville. So that's where I was raised. And really very little discussion about the Holocaust growing up. That's just the way it was, and it wasn't even mentioned. My dad and my aunt both had tattoos on their elbows from Auschwitz, and you just, again, when you're a child or teenager, that's just there, and you really don't associate much with it. But probably in the late 70s, mid-70s, it became more outspoken finally, and my folks got involved as Holocaust survivors in a nice community of fellow Holocaust survivors in Louisville. And that was important to them, but then they passed away way too young to really promulgate that. And my uncle moved to L.A. after my dad passed away in 1980, where we had some family, and settled in the Valley, where there are also a large contingent of Holocaust survivors that they connected to. And so he became very involved for many years and was one of the first interviewees of the Shoah. And what made his story so unique was playing the harmonica for the commandant. And when Steven Spielberg began talking to organizations, individuals all over the world, he would always pull up my uncle's video because it was so unique. So they had an interesting connection as a result of that. I know that. And so when he passed away in 2001, a couple of weeks before 9/11, the funeral was in, in the big nursing home in outside of Burbank, and Spielberg showed up outside, and so he didn't want to come in because he didn't want to make a scene. So I'm standing up there giving the eulogy, and the back door opens, and there's Steven Spielberg. And then, when we went to the burial site, he was standing on a hill nearby, which was pretty incredible because he didn't want to take away anything from him, but out of respect for him. So I think all that my kids, 2 daughters, understood, and even though they didn't get to see my parents because they passed away way too young, and they never even got a chance to meet Sue Ellen, so my uncle was kind of like a de facto grandfather to them, and was at their bat mitzvahs, played the harmonica at both their bat mitzvahs, and so that was important to them. They had that connection, which I think always carried on to them, which meant a lot to me.
I remember your uncle was able to tell some things that your father had not told you when
Right. So I was told when they did the original videos, which he did in December of '98 for the Shoah, I was sent a clip of it, which I understood to be the whole interview of like 30 minutes. And then in December of 21, I was invited to join the Dallas Holocaust Human Rights Museum board, and that was really important to me, of course, because of my family's connection. And in a conversation with the historian there, I mentioned it to her, and she said, well, I know you have this video. I said, yeah, it's about 30 minutes. So she said, well, let me check on it. And she called me back within 30 minutes and said, it's not 30 minutes, it's 6 hours, which stunned me because I went basically from from my first knowledge of it, 20 years or so until that moment, and sent it to me, and then I, over a period of a week or 10 days, watched the entire thing, which I learned more about my family and their journey, things that he had never disclosed, and of course my dad didn't because he passed away way too young before they chronicled that by the Shoah. And so, but the stunning part about that is that my uncle sat there on one day and was interviewed by someone from the Shoah, asking him questions, sitting on a chair, and then on the table, it was like almost a message, was a picture of his wife and a picture of my mother. So it was like she was staring at me. And so the profound impact of that, it's something I'll always remember. So, if I call up this video, there's my uncle sitting in a chair looking at this camera with a picture of my mother next to him. So, yes, I learned a lot about his journey and how he escaped and what he dealt with. And it always impressed me when you talk to Holocaust survivors, their extraordinary recollection of the most finite details of their, almost what they ate or who they talked to or how they felt. And this is, say, 75 years later or so. It's pretty astounding that they have that recollection today, but to be able to have that documented for future generations is really meaningful.
It is. When growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, what was Jewish life there?
It was a very tight Jewish community. It wasn't very transient, so everybody kind of knew where everybody lived, and the JCC was the hub. And so it was, like I said, because of that, I was involved with, like most, in BBYO, and my parents, the family business was a small business, and my dad was probably too nice of a guy to be a businessman, probably should have been a professor, which is what he was studying for at the University of Vienna, and then, so he was really a fish out of water, trying to be a businessman, and I always remember that. And so, when I went through in business school and got an MBA in finance, and I've been in the business world my whole career, it was just sort of taking it to the next level, because I knew that was just something that he just couldn't relate to particularly. But it was really a very welcoming Jewish community in Louisville, and probably Jewish population in Louisville's probably been around 10,000 forever. So we were very fortunate that it was very open and embracing Jewish community.
What did you know what he was going to study when he was going to be a professor? What is
Psychology.
Oh, in psychology. Okay.
Yeah.
And what kind of business did he have?
He had a small construction business in Louisville, remodeling and some homes that that my uncle and my dad were partners in, and so my uncle was the salesperson, the outside guy, and my dad was the inside guy. And so when he passed away, unfortunately, suddenly in '79, then we had to liquidate the business, and my uncle, then within 6 months, they moved to L.A. because we really didn't have family there at that point, and we had family in L.A. and with such a large Jewish community in the valley, especially of Holocaust survivors, they were quick to get integrated into that community, which is a wonderful thing for them for the next 20 years or so until my uncle passed away in '01.
So you moved to the Dallas community for a job,
Right.
and the first thing you did is what you came to the center. Is that?
I had moved a few times after graduate school, still in the healthcare field, and I was hired by a hospital here to run the hospital, and moved here and knew nobody, which is astounding. You think about today. I mean, I couldn't Google it. I mean, there was nothing. I just knew of the hospital and was hired by the board chair of the hospital, who lived in Highland Park, and so Jewish connections were zero. And within a couple of days of arriving here, went to the J and asked the then membership director, Joni Weinstein, where should I live? And she took out an Avis map and she drew a square around where all the Jewish kids live, and that's where I settled. And the irony is, after college, Sue Ellen settled within 2 blocks of where I lived, which is kind of an interesting thing. That it wasn't like I met her walking through the neighborhood, but it's just that we both settled within a few blocks of each other. But the J turned out to be really the lightning rod for my involvement. And a lot of the people I know today, we think back where we met, it was probably on the basketball court at the J or playing softball. Mm-hmm. So it's always been a very important part of our emergence within the Jewish community of Dallas.
Mm-hmm. I know when we had talked that you've stayed active since you've been a chair of Federation. Is there anything you'd like to share your thoughts about for your children, your grandchildren, about being Jewish, being active in the community?
It's just, for them, I think they've recognized how important it was as a part of our life. And again, it's not just about writing checks, but just being involved. And then there are those who are blessed that can do both. And so carrying on the tradition is really important. And so we have, our daughters are both, our daughter in Houston has family and 3 grandkids, and kids go to Jewish school, and it's just really important to see that. It's a real blessing. So I don't really have to say anything, Sue and I, but just knowing how important it is for them. And so I know that legacy will carry on without a doubt from generation to generation. So that just happened. And our daughter in Seattle and her husband, they're Jewish, and in certain, there certain things are really important to them, which are very meaningful, like Hanukkah is very important to them. They, if Sue Ellen doesn't send candles to Shelley, which she always does, but she just knows to do that, and Passover is very important to them too. But so I think everyone kind of finds their own place, but the fact that they trace it all back, that they know that a few generations before that, their grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Really meaningful because for a lot of ways, and how they convey that, they acknowledge it obviously, especially our older daughter. Our son-in-law certainly never met my parents and never met my uncle, but heard enough. And so when the middle grandson was born, his middle name is Henry, after my uncle.
which was, was a real surprise. And, they didn't say anything about it, but when they announced that, I knew exactly why, which told me that the impact that he had on her life was something that would carry on in Graham Henry Gilbert's life.
That's lovely. Okay, well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
I just think it's important that we, pass the baton from generation to generation and documenting it, not just for people like myself, but at as fast a pace as we can, because, again, today in 2023, it's 78 years almost to the day from the end of World War II, and so someone who was 10 years old in 1945, is now 88 years old, and when they leave, they pass on, it's gone. And so I'm grateful that the Shoah picked up to where I wasn't able to connect to my uncle to document it until 98, when the Shoah was able to do that. So I know for our kids and grandkids and future generations, hopefully they'll look back and see that, and it'll have the impact of hearing and seeing what I say, just like me viewing the video testimony of my uncle a couple months ago, looking at him on my desktop.
Well, AJ, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure, and it's an honor to be able to sit here and summarize, looking back over my tenure as board chair and my role in making the Dallas Jewish community a little better than it was. And hopefully that'll continue for generations to come.
And again, thank you so much.